Hey people, sorry for the wait. Life caught up to me and said, pay attention. Anyway, expect more content from me in the future, unless my chronic procrastination says no. With that out of the way, let's discuss Chapter 4. Why 4 instead of 3.5 first? Well, we really didn't learn too much in 3.5 to declare its own video, so I will be lumping it in with 4.5. On the other hand, Chapter 4 gave us a huge amount of story. How much of it is new information? Well, watch the rest of the video, you dingus, or look at the timestamp to find out. Average person's, or at least a feather's reaction to abnormalities, is not much different from that of a person seeing a monster in real life today. We've seen that televised news is broadcasted across Wings and Wonderlab. It is doubled down on in this chapter, but it still shows that the vast majority of feathers are not aware of abnormalities or distortions. Thank you, state-based information networks. Dante can also feel the differences between distortions and abnormalities. More on that in the 3.5 and 4.5 video. If it wasn't already clear that Faust knew Dante before he had his prosthetic, this cinches it. Even in the city, we cannot get away from the typical news antics, though we later learn that this footage isn't used for the news and that they're using all this tragic footage for K-Corp's own gain. This is the first mention of mirror dungeons as a true narrative device rather than a gacha mechanic lacking ludonarrative relations. I find it funny and endearing how far they go to rationalize every small piece of the world. As a dungeon master who suffers from the same problem, I could definitely relate. Like, you're telling me it took till just now that these adventures, these level 3 little shits that just came out of their village, go and find these ancient tombs, these ancient derelict buildings, and no one's gonna deal with this? There's not someone else that's gonna deal with this? Though we can take care of these battles and abnormalities with no deaths, in canon, these beings are powerful enough to render multiple sinners dead in many fights. Lends credence to just how powerful these monstrosities are. More to show how powerful the sinners are despite being in their weakened state, alongside how terrifying it would be to fight an immortal entourage of the unhinged. Even though Faust isn't part of the research team, she is still expected to be doing extensive research alongside her sinner duties. My condolences. Perhaps it's just Dawn being Dawn, but she again promises to be a fixer of a noble cause. She wanted to meet Siegfried here after saving people, implying that she is already a fixer. I think I'm of the mind that Limbus Company isn't a fixer office, but it does hire fixers and ex-syndicate members. So, while not all sinners are fixers, some have obvious fixer experience like Ishmael, or might even still hold credentials. That's actually false, Samjo. They simply cannot fly due to how humans breed, feed, and clip their wings. Foreshadowing is a narrative device. Ah, there's the good dose of dystopianism. Regen ampules can only be applied to K-Corp staff and friends if they are suffering enough damage. So, what happens if you don't meet that criteria? Inflict it yourself. Defeats the whole point of the criteria in such an ironic way that K-Corp doesn't even notice. Heathcliff shows off more of his growing good nature and fondness for the party. He acts tough, but I'm certain deep down he's a big softie. Isn't it obvious with how he flirts with Ishmael like a child in middle school? Truth tablets first mentioned in canon. Not surprised something like this would exist within the current level of tech. First in-character mention of the League of Nine, which includes Gubo, Dongrang, Dongbik, and Yongji, as well as a few others that are currently of less importance. To summarize for the rest of the video, they were a group of researchers who sought knowledge for knowledge's sake, until they were betrayed, and the remnants were either killed off, or formally absorbed by various wings. I see people thinking Yi Sang is on the verge of distorting here. I cannot help but think this is not even close to true. While Yi Sang is thoroughly depressed, that's not a prerequisite for distorting. His views of the world, and more importantly of himself, are intact. This scene, I feel, more thoroughly shows the simple loss of what once made one whole, that being his connection with his allies and his ability to share his discovery with them. Feather ranks are the opposite of fixer grades, where fixers want lower numbers to denote their importance. Wings denote their feathers with increasing numerical order to denote their importance. Moral principles? In this world, just goes to show that wings act on another level from most everything else we've seen so far. Though this is most likely due to their government levels of contracts keeping people bound. Ryoshu sums up my feelings exactly. And here we can see that everyone got a promise of their greatest desire being fulfilled if they worked for Limbus Company. Most seem in line with their narrative counterpoints, but we've yet to see any major changes to the source inspirations. It was here that I realized that the similarities between the Seed of Light project and the Sinners' trials in their dungeons. It can be said that everyone came out a healthier person at the end of their dungeon. Rhodia just had the least amount of growth because Project Moon absolutely dumpstered her chapter.
In Night City you can become...
That's what happens when you jump into unrefined tears. What a life. If all singularities are eldritch abominations like this, I will be extremely happy. We already know what a horrible process Cogito entails, so it's safe to assume that bows are far more from what they seem as well. And while we have seen the effects and products of many more singularities over the series, we haven't gotten a good look at how they are produced up until now. As Dongrang explains, just because something is put into a concept incinerator, it doesn't mean it can't be discovered again. It acts more like deleting a save file. All that progress is gone, but nothing is stopping someone from finding it again. As Oidus and Faust theorize, it is extremely likely the head has placed a citywide taboo on any kind of resurrection technology. It would make sense so far as the head has predominantly tried to keep a sense of the human experience within the city. Guns should be limited to keep killing an intimate experience, and the rule that no destruction of residential property should be interpreted as housing as a human right. Even the fact that very little is being done about the existence of abnormalities and distortions, because they could be considered peak human experiences. I could say more about it, but it would be a very big spoiler for the end of Library Aruna, and I know not everyone has gotten there. Right at the start of the dungeon, we get to see an incredibly big portal that is tearing through time and space to manifest Yisang's ego with its resonance. Like Gregor's ego previously, the events work out like a play that are scripted and unchangeable. However, since this one was drastically different in its creation, outside forces are drawn to the discrepancies. In T-Corp, having any color outside of their brown monochrome was considered a privilege. They did so to limit individuality from the territory. It can be inferred that possessing colors is a taboo here. Taboos are amongst the most fun world building for me, personally, since you get to see just how crazy dystopian the tech in the city can be. Being able to steal colors, something literally everyone outside of the blind take for granted, is so utterly, comically, and cartoonishly evil that I can't help but smile and admire the audacity of it. We can most likely assume that Heathcliff is from T-Corp given their Victorian-era steampunk aesthetic, as well as his insightful and personal commentary on the reaping of colors. We do get a good amount of insight into the pseudo-leader of the League of Nine, Young-ji, a kind-hearted man who is seen as the brightest among the League. It was Young-ji who created the base window technology, which would go on to inspire Yisang's mirror tech, a feat actually encouraged by brother Young-ji. We'll learn that the League originated in a small town in S-Corp. Doubling on that fact, Yisang has apparently loaded enough to support the League's financial issues when cracks begin to arise in their ethics and rules. It's here that we begin to see a recreation of events begin to leak into another's mind, that being of K-Corp's founder, Stefanet's outskirts traveling companion. She found the singularity tearful thing in the remains of her companion, and who had been reading sad stories so that their tears could be collected and processed into a product. However, it was after Stefanet's passing that the board of directors had a rather violent brawl in front of Tearful Thing, and realized that they could just force it to cry by viewing the horrendous acts instead of virtuous stories. The children may yearn for the mines, but Yisang built them factories instead. It was upon third viewing that I spotted the foreshadowing of one who wishes for nothing more than to have wings come to blows with one whose desire is to constantly remove wings from chickens, however harmless it might be. It is in the lowest floor of the dungeon that we learn of Herman's goal, to destroy all the worlds and possibilities the mirror can peer into. Someone most certainly doesn't love the city they live in. Faust drops a very interesting hypothesis during Dongrang's distortion. Distortions are not the final step, rather a middle ground to something potentially greater. Very, very, very interesting. Dongrang, if my memory is to be believed, is the first to pull a reverse Philip, in that he distorts first and then manages to finalize his ego. This is what I believe Faust meant in her hypothesis. His full title of Effloresced Ego Farmwatch is the key. Effloresced means to dilute into a powder through a loss of moisture, or to reach an optimum stage of development. Does this mean that egos formed after distorting produce optimum ego? Or that egos themselves are the peak of human development? The fact that effloresced was used to describe ego is very insightful. We know that Carmen is always there when people distort, but doesn't really care if they manifest or distort, only that they do either. Ego being described as peak development means that there's an optimum outcome regarding the two. As for who considers it optimum, that remains to be seen. Overall, I was quite happy with this chapter. Getting to see some substantial growth out of Yisang made me oh so happy. What I am less happy about is how much filler was in the already long chapter. It made it a nightmare to try and go through all together and have a complete picture of what's going on. They easily could have kept out most of the blank combat chapters and it would have been a fantastically long chapter. From my count, 23 instances were purely combat and could have been cut entirely. That's practically half of the chapter. And I wasn't even including the blank stages in the dungeon. 31 stages would still make it the longest chapter we've received by far. Chapter 3 only had 22 stages, including filler. The story, though, is pretty good. I feel that there was too much running around between the locations and needless plot contrivances, but for what we did learn about the sinners, it was well worth the wait, I believe.
Oh. Oh. Oh.